Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, ngā mihi nui. I'm delighted to be here and accept this invitation to speak today. I really like talking to emerging researchers. Though one thing I've learned is that grown-ups sneak in. So Richard Blakey is definitely not emerging. And the other thing I've noticed is that people film these things, so I can't be quite as loose as the one that you first heard me talk at. So when you get jobs like this one, people ask you to talk about your leadership journey. And I don't know about you, but when I go to leadership journey talks, one of two things happens. One is that I think, really? Or the other is that I feel so intimidated that I just think I may as well give up. And I think the reason is that people tend to post hoc rationalize their career. So it sounds really good, like it sounds quite good in that bio. But what I'd like to do is give you a bit of a flavor of how I felt it, as well as what I did, because it wasn't particularly planned or glamorous, and I don't think I'm a particularly good example. So I'll give you a flavor of the leadership journey that was just read out, but also the one that's not on my CV, which I tend not to mention. And the version of this talk that you heard me give was quite gendered, but I don't want to do that on camera. So I will just allude to the gender parts and we can talk about that over the wine later. But that's why there's a glass ceiling on the slide. So this is the cleaned up version of the talk I gave in Auckland. I'll just give you a few thoughts and reflections and hopefully start a discussion. And I thought, since you've given me a generous amount of time, maybe I would try and distill out a few tips that I wish I'd known when I was sitting there. And most of those are on what I now realize is leadership, but at the time I didn't really notice it was, so I wish someone had told me these things when I was at your career stage. And then I thought I'd give you a case study of leading the Marsden Fund, which is a place that I've got now some distance from, and I've had a thought about if and when I used my own tips. And if you want to talk about my current role at the end, I'm really happy to answer questions. But that is the moral of the story. I'm not in any way trying to suggest that you follow in my footsteps because I'm not sure I did it the best way. So the leadership journeys talks that I always find a bit hard to believe are the ones that start with the schoolgirl that wanted to know why the gecko crawled across the ceiling and somehow knew she was going to be a famous scientist. I was not that person. I like dressing up silly, and I just wanted a job. I hadn't really thought about what I was going to do. I certainly had no aspirations whatsoever to be a scientist or a professor. I did have the obligatory school teacher that told me that I should aim high and I was good at chemistry, and I also had the obligatory sexist school teachers who said girls can't do physics. Nearly all my science teachers were male, and all but one of my university lecturers were male, so I didn't have many female role models. So one of the things I like to do is put up pictures of females rather than just men as I go through so that people can see who they could be. Does that microphone sound okay to you? It sounds a bit weird to me. Is it good? Yeah. So after a series of rather ramshackle schools, there were British comprehensive schools, and I moved about every 2 years. Thanks to Mr. Parrott, I managed to get into Oxford. So this is the bit where the stories coincide, like my real CV and how I felt it. This was good. That was smart. Do that. I stayed there for 7 years, and I got hooked on proteins. So that is a picture of the protein with which I became obsessed for many years, dihydropicolinate synthase. We had a breakup after my PhD, but we got back together. And a lot of you will be biochemists in the room, I know. You will recognize it's got a quaternary structure. For those of you who don't know what that means, I just became obsessed with how you pull it apart and put it back together. Think of it as Lego. I've never been very good at concentrating. Bad. If you want to be a famous scientist, learn to concentrate. And so every summer I tended to drift off and do something else. So I went to the States and worked in Sizzler, steak, seafood and salad. Can I help you? I was sponsored for my PhD by Shell, so I sometimes went there and learnt about what it was like doing science in that corporate environment. And most notably, and I do recommend you put this line on your CV, I was the cook and prawn sorter aboard the Francana off the coast of Queensland. That's the line on your CV where it says, I'm not boring, and people say, oh yeah, we'll interview her. Somewhere in all that, I decided that I was fed up of Oxford because it was the sort of place where when you said, can you pass the sugar at morning tea, somebody said, that was my idea. People were very clever, but they didn't seem to me very nice. With the benefit of hindsight, I realized how valuable that time was. But when I finished my PhD, I never wanted to see dihydrodipicyllinate synthase again. And I was fed up of buying a newspaper and being answered in Greek. I just wanted to find somewhere that people were a bit realer and I could have a bit more work-life balance. So that was the stage I was at. I was just talking to some people in microbiology and they were like, I don't know about this science thing. And I'm like, yeah, I was like that. So for reasons that are far too long to explain, I decided to go to the other side of the world. Turned out that was a good move, but it's not actually something I recommend. So those are things that you shouldn't do, especially the second bullet point. So all my contemporaries at Oxford to this day say, what were you doing? Some of them rang me up and said, are you committing academic suicide? You know, nobody thought that that was a smart move, either the supervisor or the change of hemisphere. And I didn't have any particular attachment to scientific ambition or getting a postdoc. I think in New Zealand in 1993, there weren't really any postdocs anyway. So I just got a job because that's what I thought was a good thing to do. And I got a job at Crop and Food. So having left Oxford thinking that my career goal was to apply protein science to cure cancer, I accidentally ended up curing croissants. But I did a reasonable job of it. So the ones, the big ones, are the ones that have got transglutaminase in. That's an enzyme that cross-links proteins, so there is still a protein thing going. And the control is the one that's like the one that you pick up in a hotel breakfast bar, if you've ever had that experience, that hasn't quite puffed up. That's because it's been frozen, and when it's been frozen, all the proteins in the pastry sheets lose their strength, they lose their cross-linking, and so if you put a cross-linking enzyme in there, then you put it in the oven, they puff up. They also turn out to be relatively immunogenic once you've done that, so I don't recommend eating them. But it was a good story while it lasted. There's another story there which needs much more wine. And I also had my children there, and that's where I maybe found a little bit of glass ceiling. So they're actually dressed in the old Crop and Food corporate colours, but that's a coincidence. So I learnt a lot at Crop and Food. I learnt that I really didn't want to work on pastry anymore. But I had learned that you needed to get funding for research. It was a really good environment in an early Crown Research Institute to focus on the difference your research might make and learn how to get money. So I decided I missed being with young people and I missed the teaching, and I really, really should try a bit harder to get back into the university, and finally did. So it took me a few goes. Having had 2 kids and divorced the guy in chemistry was not the best career move, but eventually they gave up and gave me a job. My publication record was odd by then. It had very few papers from my PhD because I had taken the Shell sponsorship deal, and they said I couldn't publish until they went through their IP processes, and then that unit shut, so that got completely locked down. And then there was lots of stuff on bread going stale, which didn't really impress anybody at the University of Canterbury. But eventually I blagged my way in, and cutting a long story short, I spent the next however many years that is, turning into a professor and playing with proteins. So you might recognize the shape of that one in the middle. I went back to my old love, dihydrodipicyllinate synthase, and we did some lovely Marsden research, finishing my PhD off properly. So I do now understand why it's tetramer, if anybody cares. And because of all the experience I'd had at Crop and Food, again, not the world's best academic career move, but coming in handy now, I'd learnt how to write an introduction that got things funded. So we looked at what you could do with protein quaternary structure in the context of designing new drugs, fiddling with food, which I'd already done, and the direction that took off later on, making new nanomaterials and nanodevices. And I should thank Richard partly for that direction, because he was the one who bought me a coffee and talked about the McDiarmid Institute, which led me that way. So Having gone back to the university to try and do something more significant than stop bread going stale and cure croissants, I ended up trying to cure acne. So never try and anticipate where your research might take you. So one of the things we got funding to do was try and create these protein nanostructures on a large scale. And we used all sorts of waste materials, including fish eyes. And we ended up forming a company while I was at Callaghan Innovation on a fellowship called High Aspect. We swapped to milk, so it's not actually fish by the time it went commercial. But we ended up making kilograms of protein nanofibrils, and we had all these dreams of wound care products and things. But there was an investment from a private investor, good news, that wanted to go into cosmetics. Not bad news, but not really my sort of news. So I'm no longer involved with this company, but I'm really glad that it's still going and that our protein fibril scaffold's being used as a delivery agent. So if you go into a pharmacy and look for the new Logic range, that contains protein nanofibrils, who knew? Whether it cures your acne or not, I will not comment on. But using the scaffold as a delivery agent did turn out to be commercially useful. And as I said earlier, I was never very good at concentrating, so while I was doing this, I got involved in governance. Now, I'm not sure I knew what governance was until I got involved in it. I don't think when I got the job at Crop and Food, I really knew how the board related to the chief executive. There was like my boss, his boss, his boss, his boss, and then the board. And I don't think I really fully understood how all those things connect. But it turns out I quite like governance. You get to sit around a table and make suggestions, and then someone else goes off and does it. Whereas if you're a manager, you have to actually do it. So if anybody ever asks you if you're interested in governance, say yes and give it a thought. So it's one of those things you can do on the side of any career because you only have to turn up once a month and there are legal obligations and blah, blah, blah. But it gives you a portal into another organization and broadens your horizons a bit. So I really enjoyed that. So I chaired the Marsden Fund for a while. There's a caption competition still running for that photograph. I won't tell you the current front runner. I'll tell you a bit about Marsden in a second. And I was also on the board of Plant and Food Research, which is funny because that's where I got my first job when they merged. And so, yeah, I ended up on that board. And that picture is there because one of the jobs I had on that board was to oversee the governance responsibilities for building the big new lab at Mount Albert. So there's a big $60 million project. So that was a big responsibility and a lot of fun seeing the building of a lab from the other side. And then somewhere out of all that, my current role appeared. I did not apply for this job. It's being filmed, isn't it? I won't tell it that way. I once got a random phone call from the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet that came through as no caller ID, and they said, "You've been called for interview for the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor." And I said, "Sorry, I didn't apply, wrong number." Wait. I honestly had no idea that I was on that radar. They finally explained it was Peter Gluckman's job, and I said, "I don't want to be Peter Gluckman." And then they told me a bit more about the job, and I thought, oh, well, I may as well stay in for the interview, and I ended up getting it. The world is very male. That picture at the top is Peter Gluckman's first selfie. You'll see in the background a very typical kind of Wellington senior sciencey image, lots of senior white men, not many women. And so one of the things I'm enjoying is putting some new photographs into that mix. So that is a Women in Science photo on your right there. That's my boss with my daughter. My boss is pregnant. And that is Laura, who's just taken a senior lectureship in engineering at Canterbury. She's worked with me for a long time, and her daughter meeting my boss. So we've had some fun taking pictures like that. I won't talk for a lot about the role, but I've given a few forums outlining that the vision I went in with was to create a trusted, accessible bridge between scientists, society, and government. So that's why I like doing things like this, so that people can see that if they have some cool science that might be helpful for government policy, or if they see a warning on the horizon, they can approach the office, and we just provide a shortcut, if you like, to getting information into the government. And I framed what I do around those 4 principles: inclusive, rigorous, transparent, and accessible, which I took from a Nature paper which came out the month before I started. And one of the things I'm learning is this challenge of time scale, and I'll come to this in my case study in a minute. So policymakers would like the answer of what the evidence base looks like by maybe next Thursday. They haven't got time for you to finish your master's thesis and do the final control. So giving advice that's sensible, evidence-informed, but not overstated, is really hard. So that's like a lightning CV. That's what got read out, and that's how I actually felt it. So it genuinely didn't feel like it gets read out. So if you're sitting there thinking, oh, I'll never be able to do that, read that one. And the moral of the story is you can completely mess things up and think you're in a cul-de-sac. So you're stuck stopping bread going stale in Christchurch, New Zealand with 2 kids and you just got divorced. But it comes out okay. And definitely learn from your mistakes, maybe mine. One thing that I think is characteristic of what I've done is I've always said yes. So people will spend ages telling you how to say no, but sometimes say yes too. Yes is good. Be your authentic self. So one of the ways people find jobs stressful is to try and be someone else, like I should be wearing a suit and I should be doing this, I should look like Richard Blakey, I look nothing like Richard Blakey, but I'm supposed to look like you, aren't I, in my role? No, says Richard, you're supposed to look like me. But there's something about making sure that you don't try and squeeze yourself into a person that you're not. So if you can't do a job as yourself, go find another job to do. That was a good tip that somebody gave me. And I don't know whether not airbrushing my story is a good idea. You can tell me at the end. And the last one I put there segues into what I thought you might like to talk about for the rest, which is embrace opportunities to lead, which I don't think is something that really gets raised at the PhD postdoc. It's like, lead with your ideas, but maybe not lead people. People don't frame it like that. So there's a picture for you. And I think the Trump pose there is traditionally what people often see as leadership. And I've been trying to think, especially with my current boss, how we might redefine that. I think the days of finger wagging will be over soon. That's my hope anyway. So have a think as I go through what sort of leaders have inspired you and why. Now, we won't have a discussion because it's like not the right format, but I didn't ask myself that question for a long time. In fact, the first time was when someone told me to talk about leadership and I needed to frame it somehow. But it's actually a really useful thing to do. So here's some people who have inspired me. The ones in square frames are academics, and some are Kiwis, some are from overseas. You'll recognize Paul probably. The ones not in squares are from outside academia. And Michael Ahi in particular is someone who chaired the Plant and Food Board when I was on it. His day job is about leadership and building strong performing teams, and I learned a lot from him about the skills around leadership without the content. So often academic leaders are thought of as the people that know the most or have the best insights. But actually there's soft skills that are really important, and Michael focuses on those soft skills, so he taught me a lot. And of course, the boss has been an inspiration in that sense. So then I thought, and you will have a different set of people, and they will have a different set of qualities which will match your leadership style better than you don't want mine, you want yours. But when I thought, what do they have in common? That's what came out. So they're really different people from all different parts of academia and outside academia, but they all have those general characteristics. So there's something about authenticity and being honest and open and positive. And when you try and distill it into one thing, it's a gift for building consensus from diverse opinions. So it's getting a whole pile of people in the room and figuring out what it is that they agree and disagree on in a nice, robust way, and then finding out what they could all go forward with together. Obama could do that and Trump doesn't do that, right? So that's the difference, hence the picture. So then I thought, well, how do these people that I admire build that consensus? And tried to map that onto some tips, which are ones I've picked up as I've gone along that I wished I'd known before. So, number one, and I think this is the most important, and it hardly ever happens in a staff meeting, is decide how to decide before the decision. So what tends to happen, especially with academics who are very good at finding loopholes and picking holes in arguments, is that people try and agree how to vote or how to make a decision before they get to the crunch point. Very rarely. So what they tend to do is say, oh no, add it up this way because then my opinion will sway, or we'll vote, or no, we won't vote, depending on how they think the decision will go according to their position. So having a completely abstract discussion about how you decide things before you get to any issues at all, before you're close to falling out, is really important. And this is one of the first conversations I had in the Marsden Council. So people dice it up in different ways, but you can say, okay, I'll decide. Or you can say, we'll discuss and then I'll decide. Or you can say, we'll decide. Or you can hand it over and say, you'll decide by some voting mechanism. But you need to be really clear on that before the issue is actually surfacing. I've always tried to do, we'll decide. But for this job, I have to do, we'll discuss and I'll decide, because I've got this very direct reporting line to the PM, and there's so many different people who are stakeholders. Tip 2, ask advice. You don't have to take the advice, but ask the advice. Especially ask the advice for people who you disagree with. It's nice that people feel heard. That was a really good tip that I got early on. Tip 3, decide with your IQ and lead with your EQ, and do that however it works for you. I try and do it with humour. If you need to do something tough, you can often do it with humour better than without humour. So you need to be really on top of the theory and really understand why it is you've decided something, but you then need to understand everybody's point of view and have a bit of empathy. So people get criticised for doing one or the other, and I think you can decide with one and lead with the other. Might not work for you, you might need to do it the other way around, but think about how you're making decisions and how you communicate them. This was a good one I got from Michael Ahi, and that's think hard about giving and receiving feedback. So he recommended that I read this book called Radical Candor. Now it's a bit cheesy, and it's sort of a management book, so it jars a bit if you're used to being in an academic environment. But basically it says there's 2 axes when you're giving feedback: how much you care and how much you challenge. And the people who lead best and give the best feedback, this is leading a team, have what they've framed here as radical candor. So you don't say, yes, everything's wonderful. You say, you know what, those 3 things were wonderful. I think you can do better on those 2, and that was a disaster. So you put it in a positive way, and you make it clear that you're there to support the person, but you give them honest feedback. That is supposedly the most successful way of leading, but very rare, because it's quite hard to do. It's easy to tip into one of the other boxes. According to the book, and the evidence base is small, but it matches my experience, obnoxious aggression is the second most successful. And that is because, it's the theory, at least the person is getting feedback. They're not feeling supportive or warm, but they are getting some active feedback. So don't go there, go there. But that's supposed to be more successful than ruinous empathy, which is where you say everything is lovely. And manipulative insincerity is if you don't care and you don't challenge. So, you know, no, you don't look fat in that. It's that sort of thing. So it's just throwaway comments, leave my room. So ruinous empathy is for people who aren't good at challenging, and obnoxious aggression is for people who don't really care. And radical candor is that one in the middle. So I think that's a useful thing to frame feedback when you start to be supervising people and leading people. Number 5, all about relationships. When you come out of an academic environment and you've got a GPA of 4,000 and the best ideas and the best publication and the best H index, you tend to forget this. I mean, everybody kind of knows, but those things count a lot as you progress in any career. So keep your word, deliver, over-deliver, be on time, be easy to work with, don't be an asshole. And I put be relentlessly positive in there as a nod to the boss, but it just said be positive there before I got this job. I really like high trust environments where everybody's trusted to get on with things. They're quite rare. So if you find one, cherish it, and if you can make one, even better. Most people would rather hire someone who was good at relationships that wasn't quite as good academically as the person who had trouble with relationships in any kind of senior leadership role. Number 6, don't take the monkey. Has anyone heard that phrase? Yeah, you've taken some monkeys. So, one thing that you do, if you value relationships and you're being nice to people, is people will come to you with their problems. Someone once said, this is a biochemistry joke, that you could extract lysozyme from my couch when I was a junior lecturer because people kept crying on it because I had one of those faces. So people will come to you with their troubles. And be sympathetic and help them solve it, but don't take the problem away. And someone once walked into my office and said, whoa, it's full of monkeys in here, and I had no idea what they were talking about, but it was because I was trying to solve people's problems for them. And sometimes you need to, and sometimes you should, but in general, if someone comes into your office and you are at capacity and you just don't have room for the monkey, don't take the monkey. And number 7, trust your judgment. My daughter says I shouldn't say ask forgiveness, not permission anymore. I mean in a professional context, obviously. There's many times when there's a silly rule, and you could say, this is a silly rule, I think I might break it. And someone will say, no, you mustn't, it's the rule. Whereas if you turn up and say, that was a silly rule, so I broke it, and here's why, and here's what I did, you tend to have more success. That relies on good judgment, but if you've got good judgment, trust your judgment and just go for it. There are some really silly rules. So that's it. Those are my 7 tips. They're not all the things that I think are useful. They're just things that I happen to wish that I knew. So I thought that was a bit abstract, so I give you a story about how some of those things go into play. How long have I got? 15 minutes? Yeah. So this is about leading the Marsden Council. Now, the Marsden Council is nominally in charge of a lot of money. So you've all heard of it. It's all the research funding for basic research in New Zealand outside the HRC, I guess. It's a leadership role chairing the Marsden Council, but it's a really complicated one. So the Marsden Fund Council is over there. As chair, you are appointed by the minister, as are all the other members independently. The minister also instructs the ministry to give funding to the Royal Society, which administers it on your behalf. It's not a simple leadership role at all. So that's why it's a governance role. That's what they call a complicated management governance structure. And it's there partly because it's a messy bureaucracy and it's frustrating, and partly for really good reasons, which is it in many ways prevents ministerial intervention in decisions made by the council. So if you have a simpler structure, you tend to have ministerial sign-off, and if you have ministerial sign-off, then you can get political interference into what gets funded. So it's a good thing. If anyone ever asks you to take part in an org chart like that, later on say you're good at complex stakeholder management. It took me ages to work that out. So somewhere from that position, you're supposed to lead the fund and be the steward of the fund and respond to all the rabid researchers who want more money to increase the fund, which we did. This is my favourite graph. So I took over where that little blue arrow is, and then it started going up. And that's not all my work, but I'm going to take all the credit. So you'll see it had been going up, and we'd stalled for particular reasons. And Peter Hunter, who I took over from, had made a lot of the groundwork, which allowed me to help turn the graph around. Normally, at some point, somebody says, that's not an increase in real terms. So the inset shows that it is an increase in real terms. So to get from stalled to a position where it was guaranteed to keep going up, you'll see that goes all the way to 2020. The last increase has only just come in. There were a few challenges. And the first challenge I call changing the mood. So somebody politely said that I'd been given the role as chair of the Marsden Council as a relatively junior woman because they wanted to shut it. So thank you. That wasn't completely a joke. There were behind-the-scenes conversations when the national government had come in about the value of the Marsden Fund and whether it should keep going. I never heard about that officially. I heard about that from strange men in the Curry Lounge who put their hand on my shoulder and said, how's it going? And I said, how's what going? Because no one had actually told me that that was the issue. So there were obviously some backroom conversations that hadn't surfaced. It was 2012 and the Marsden Fund had dropped to an 8% success rate, which is an international low, or high, if you say that we're the choosiest. And the message coming out of the council and from the research community was that this fund was in crisis, that it was just too low, all these good ideas on the floor, all this wasted time writing bids that weren't getting funded, none of which I disagreed with, but there's two ways to solve a crisis in a fund, and one is to increase it and the other is to shut it, and I didn't rate our chances if we went with the fund in crisis narrative. So we needed to change the mood. One of the problems for that was this mismatched timescale thing again. So now I have to deal with that on a much more immediate basis, but this was my first example of it. So political cycles are 3 years. That's a long time for people in the real world, but quite short for someone doing basic research. And if you're doing basic research, let's say you might have an impact in 20 years or you might not because it was high risk. But somewhere in there is a shared narrative around we all want to make a difference, and there needs to be an understanding of each other's timeframes. Sometimes you just can't compromise and you have to stick your neck out and battle for the most important thing. So in the Marsden Fund, it's completely fundamental research and you can't pick winners by definition. But that doesn't mean that the fund shouldn't make a difference. And so we spent a lot of time as a council thinking about this, and this was wheel decide. We put some wheel decide rules around how we made decisions. We all agreed that if we funded 100 proposals every year for 20 years, some of them would hit gold, but we couldn't say which ones. So that means that the Marsden Fund Council, as a council, should be responsible for having an impact, that is, making a difference. But it shouldn't trickle down to the individual proposals. And that is how we got through our investment plan process, and ultimately how we got the level of funding up, because we managed to make the argument that the fund itself had an impact, but the proposals couldn't necessarily see what their impact would be. That's a good story, and good stories are good stories. So the other thing we said was, okay, we're 20 years old. There's Catherine. Nice dress, Catherine. So what we wanted to do was stop whining about the fund being in crisis and start celebrating all the amazing things we've done. So our time frame, we said, was 20 years, and 20 years before we'd been funding great research, so we invited lots of people back. We had a party, we got Stephen Joyce to front it, and we celebrated all the good things we could do. Much better political message, because he could be proud of the fund. He's not hearing people grizzle. We invited everyone. We spent too much money, thanks to the Royal Society for subsidising it, and we tried to change the mood so that we were celebrating. Of course, academics aren't known for celebrating, so this was the bit where I sucked it up and took a few monkeys. So every year in Marsden, there's 1,200 people and over 1,000 rejections. Most of those people take it on the chin. A small number don't. And those grizzles can escalate. So one of the private goals I had when I was chairing the Marsden Council was not to have any complaints in Parliament, because those sorts of things mean you're not going to get an increase. So we did all sorts of things around requesting that people use descriptive, not silly sounding titles, and we put in place a series of layers for what I call the acute cases of entitleitis, for the chronic entitleitis sufferers that flare up when their Marsdens get rejected, to take complaints seriously. So we understand that people pour their whole life into this proposal, and we understand that maybe it was my personal fault that they didn't get the Nobel Prize. But that doesn't mean they should complain about the fund. It just means that they should challenge our processes, sure, but let's keep it in the family, so that overall the image of the fund is one that does great stuff, and that the Royal Society and the Marsden Council has a culture of hearing feedback and complaints. So that took some energy, but I think it was worth it. Engaging with the policymakers is important, more so now. So a lot of what I learnt that was useful preparation for this job I did around the increase. We need to speak their language. If they've got a document they need to prepare to convince the minister to increase the fund, why not help? You might not agree with the way they've written it, you might not agree with the way it's framed, but let's help. everyone else should respond too. So getting in behind the officials who are trying to increase the research funding rather than complaining is really important. The National Statement of Science Investment came out, and it explicitly signalled on page 32 of draft 4 that there would be an increase for Marsden. We were very happy when we saw that. So we went proactively and responded. We put out a press statement, which we never normally did, saying, fantastic, this is all the ideas that are being wasted, this is how we'd spend the money. And most riskily, we bought the mantra that evidence-based decisions need evidence, and we opened up the books to Adam Jaff from Motu and asked him to interrogate the fund to show it made a difference. Now that was brave. That was a tough council decision. Again, it was a we'll decide. There were voices on the council at the time that said, what if it doesn't make a difference? And I said, well, if it doesn't make a difference, don't we need to know? And so he did an independent study on condition he would publish it, which he did. You won't be able to read the fine print, but it got some press attention. You could interpret the results to say that we didn't need the second round because it wasn't discriminating. Or you could interpret the results to say there were so many good proposals in the second round, we should double the fund. And so we had that debate on the radio, Adam and I. There was lots of coverage in the press. And down the bottom, Mr. Joyce said that he was going to try and increase it if funds permitted. So that was good. He was happy that we provided some evidence. And that involved some engagement with the press. We also front-footed press interest whenever we could, especially if there was a contentious proposal. So the most contentious proposal during my watch was one on pornography. There was a very easy narrative that the press might come up with that said we just spent $1 million of taxpayers' money on pornography, which indeed we had. We included in that research proposal was a pornography exhibition, which was quite eye-opening. But rather than pretend it wasn't happening or wait to be reactive, I actually went up there. I got thanked for my contribution to pornography research, which was novel. And we got good press, because the point, of course, of the exhibition and the active social science research that was going on was that this was a provocation. They were studying society's reaction to it. It was pornography through a different lens, so it was different ways of viewing it, and it was to raise awareness and study societal reaction to the increased exposure of children to pornography, which is a huge issue, and this was a way that it was being studied. So we had to front foot that. So that one didn't get to Parliament. It did get on TV3 and it got some good coverage. So fantastic research up at Auckland. But without the front footing, I don't think we'd ever have got our increase, because that's the fund that spends money on pornography. Every year, we used to go through the list and pick out the ones that might be contentious and have people ready to talk to the press. There was one year where it was just after there'd been some high-profile rape issues in the news, and quite a few of the social science researchers were looking at rape culture and what was causing this. And somehow the press got hold of it and said we were funding rape culture, as if we were kind of sponsoring it. And this really dark narrative came out. But we had Linda Smith ready to be interviewed on the radio, and she turned it around in 10 minutes explaining what it was. So those things were important. And last important tip, say thank you. That's what my mother always taught me. People tend to say, oh, it's not enough, oh, we could double it, oh, we're just scratching the surface. But actually, that was a lot of money. And it was a lot of money from a government that wasn't naturally aligned, perhaps, with academic, curiosity-driven research. So being grateful and explaining the difference it made a difference. And we celebrated with some strange outfits. So last slide. I hope I've given you a tone of how the next generation of scientists needs to stop wagging fingers and lead in a different way, to listen to people, listen to concerns, listen to policymakers, listen to the public, and serve the public. So I think maybe over the last century or so, science has got very, I don't want to say arrogant, but very self-contained and very sure of its own framework, and that's being more and more challenged. People tend not to respect experts so much. So I think it's more about asking people what problems they're trying to solve and how we might help solve them. And that certainly is true for the Science Advisory Network, which I'm happy to talk about in the questions, but I think it might be true for a really broad range of science. Thank you.
was a great talk, Juliet. That was really, really good. Questions for Juliet?
Kia ora, Juliet. I just want to, I'm Sharon Leach, I'm a GP candidate in the Department of General Practice. Thank you very much for such an inspiring talk. I just wondered if you could comment about the glass ceiling effect for women in health leadership roles in New Zealand, whether you feel they're still present, and if so, what steps could we take to mitigate it? What should female researchers be doing to challenge the status quo?
Yeah, I like to think that it's cracked. So you can find examples most places now. It's very different from when I was an undergraduate. But there's no way the problem's solved. And often you have a woman at the very top and then a big layer of not very diverse leaders and then a bulge of women at the bottom. I only ever really hit the glass ceiling when I had the kids. That's when I really felt it. And I don't think it was particularly overt. It was more people meaning well. So there was a she'll be busy, don't give her that opportunity feel. And yes, you should dash off and get the kids because they're sick, rather than do you want to dash off or is your husband getting them? There was those kind of societal, unconscious, well-meaning signals that came out. So that took a bit of breaking through. And I think I hit it hard then when I was applying for that academic role. But other than that, at the moment, certainly, it's a double-edged sword. So people are very conscious of it, and so they might look at CVs harder to offset centuries of bias the other way. So what can we do about it? I think just keep being open about it, telling stories, not being angry and bitter, but just calmly pointing it out, and keep telling junior researchers that it's not either or. You don't have to choose between babies and career, and I think Jacinda's probably made that point quite dramatically. Yeah. That's the biggest microphone I've ever seen.
So I have a question. So for people who want to go into, well, I know that you really didn't decide, you just like stumbled across for you. For people who do want to get into like something like that, you know, what is the starting point for them?
Into what, sorry?
Into governance or things like that.
Yeah.
And policy making. How do you like break in?
So two separate things. Governance, there's all sorts of training courses, and find mentors. So there are, especially at the moment, spaces on governance training courses for a broader range of people. And I did one years before I ever did any governance. Somebody just said, did I want to do it? And I said, oh. And then it turned out to be helpful. In terms of policy, I don't think that postgrads think about policy roles much, especially in science. So if you're in the social sciences or the arts, you tend to think about it. But the policy world needs more scientists. I don't find many at all, which is one of the reasons the science advisors make a living. So how would you get into it? You would probably apply to the graduate policy analyst programs, or just look out for opportunities. And they want people who can do research, that can analyse, that are smart, that can meet deadlines, that are good at relationships, and can write for the right audience, which are many science skills. So I think that would be good if people had a bigger awareness of those sorts of roles as they open up in Wellington. They're not all in Wellington, most of them are.
Any more questions?
I just have a question. I'm like a microbiologist and work in areas that are quite contentious and quite well known to many people in the public. And one of the most challenging things that I've been thinking about over the past few years is how to reach people who don't necessarily want to be reached. And I'm talking about like anti-vaxxers or people who insist that their cold needs antibiotics, and all of those people who, for whatever reason, their path has led them to find their own sort of science or pseudoscience. And I've watched a lot of my colleagues get really personally affronted at these people and irritated at them and mad and call them stupid. But I don't really think that's the way to go.
That was really helpful, yeah.
Because I would rather kind of like educate them in in a well-meaning way. But I'm just wondering if you have any insights as to how you do that, how you manage that, and how you get science out there a little bit more to people who might be afraid of the traditional academic path or
yeah, it's a good question, and it's one that keeps me awake at night quite often. So there's some quite nice things written on this topic. There's a book called A Matter of Fact by Jess Bertson-Shaw, which covers exactly that. Have you seen it, how to communicate with people who don't believe you? One thing is, if someone didn't believe your first graph, giving them another graph is not going to help because they don't believe in graphs. And that's a trite way of saying something quite important, that people tend to say, you didn't believe this first set of facts, so here's some more and some more and some more. And I don't think that's a good place to start. Trying to find shared values, I think, is the way forward. It's not something that scientists naturally do, but if you take the anti-vaxxers, anti-vaxxers and vaxxers all want what's best for their children. So that's a good place to start. No one's going to argue with that. And then, okay, so then why do we disagree on what's best? Well, because there's all these theories that vaccines do harm. And I think when people say, oh, it's completely safe, they minimize that fear, which is a valid fear, and also don't admit that it's not completely safe. Nothing's completely safe. So instead of saying it's safe and getting locked into a binary argument, instead say it's so safe that if you vaccinated 10,000 kids, or whatever the number is, only one would suffer harm. Whereas if they got the disease, 27 would suffer harm, or whatever the numbers are. So to look at whole populations and be honest about the risk and accept that it's a real risk and those sorts of things. I mean, that particular crowd has been locked into battle for so long, but maybe for new topics as they come up, that might help. I've just had a briefing, I published it publicly, on genetic editing, which is one of those things where it's very polarized, and I managed not to get trolled. And I think that's because I listened to both sides. So I had an open line to the people who are very opposed to a law change and to the ones that are very passionate about getting the law changed, and tried to find language that at least charted a path between the two, and to say it's not either or, there's different ways of looking at it. That's the closest I've got to taking on a really political issue. I'm at the moment chairing a panel on cannabis, so invite me back next year and say, oh, your methods didn't work, did they? So that's another one that's really locked in. But I think we just need to start thinking about it, and no one's got a silver bullet, but it's a really important thing to be thinking about.
Let's just thank Juliet again. That was a great talk and a great session.
Thank you.